If historians of the future search for the precise moment the post-World War II global order finally die, they will not find it marked by an explosion, a declaration of war, or the collapse of a major bank. They will find it buried in a stack of paperwork. Dated April 2025. Signed quietly in Washington, D.C. at the time. Almost no one noticed. Social media feeds were saturated with celebrity scandals, culture wars, election drama, and algorithm-approved outrage. Financial news fixated on interest rates, AI bubbles, and quarterly earnings. Meanwhile, far from public attention, a single executive order was signed, one that dismantled over for decades of carefully constructed international law. 9 months ago, President Donald Trump signed an executive order on deep-sea mining. On the surface, it appeared unremarkable, just another piece of deregulation, another effort to cut red tape, boost domestic industry, and signal toughness on supply chains. But beneath the legal language and bureaucratic phrasing was a message so radical that it effectively rewrote humanity's relationship with the planet. The United States was no longer asking for permission with one signature. Washington declared that the treaties, conventions, and institutions created by the United Nations to govern the world's oceans would no longer restrain American economic ambition. If international law aligned with U.S. interests, it would be honored. If it did not, it would be ignored. This was not a policy adjustment, it was a return to empire economics. Today, we are diving into what may become the most lucrative, dangerous, and destabilizing resource conflict of the 21st century, not a war for territory on land but a war for the seabed itself. This is not simply a story about mining technology or environmental risk, it is the story of how the global commons collapsed and how raw imperial competition returned in its place. To understand how we arrived here, we must trace a chain reaction that began not in 2025, but in 1945. A decision made by President Harry Truman. A treaty the United States helped design and refused to join. A vacuum of power quietly filled by China. And finally, a moment when America decided that following the rules was more dangerous than breaking them. This is the battle for the ocean floor, and it has already begun. To understand the magnitude of what changed in April 2025, we first need to understand the asset class at the center of this conflict, because when most people look at the ocean, they see emptiness. A vast, blue expanse of water, a transportation route, a boundary between nations. But when a geologist, a mining executive, or a national security planner looks at the ocean, they see something very different. They see inventory. Specifically, they see the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific Ocean, a remote stretch of Absol Plain, roughly the size of the continental United States, lying 4 to 5 kilometers beneath the surface. Down there, in permanent darkness and crushing pressure, sits the largest untapped deposit of strategic minerals ever discovered by humanity. Scattered across the seabed are trillions of small, potato-sized rocks known as polymetallic nodules. They look unremarkable, but crack one open, and you find the raw inputs of modern civilization: manganese, nickel, copper, and cobalt. These are not luxury metals, they are not ornamental, they are structural. Without them, there is no electric vehicle revolution, no grid-scale battery storage, no advanced missile guidance systems, no drones, no satellites, no data centers, no modern military. For decades, these nodules were effectively protected by economics. They were too deep, too expensive, and too technologically complex to extract. It was cheaper to tear open mountains, poison rivers, and dig ever deeper pits on land. But that equation has changed. Land-based deposits are degrading, ore grades are falling, environmental opposition is rising, and geopolitical tensions have transformed mineral supply chains from commercial concerns into national security vulnerabilities. At the same time, advances in robotics, offshore engineering, and deep-sea navigation, many of them developed for oil, gas, and military purposes have made the abyss reachable. What was once science fiction is now an Excel spreadsheet. The race is no longer about whether deep-sea mining is possible. It is about who gets there first and under whose rules. Because the moment these nodules move from the seabed into a refinery, they stop being rocks. They become leverage. They become bargaining chips. They become weapons in economic warfare. And that raises the most dangerous question of all: who owns the bottom of the ocean? For most of human history, the answer was simple: no one did. For most of recorded history, humanity had a surprisingly simple answer to the question of ocean ownership. No one owned it. The seas were governed by a doctrine known as freedom of the seas, a principle that emerged in the 17th century at the height of early maritime empires. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. The ocean was too vast, too fluid, and too uncontrollable for any single power to monopolize. It was a highway, not a homestead. Under this system, national sovereignty ended just 3 nautical miles from the coastline, the maximum distance a cannonball could be fired from shore. This so-called cannon shot rule defined the limit of state power. Beyond that thin strip of water, the ocean was international territory, open to trade, open to travel, open to all. This framework worked because it matched the technology of the time. Empires moved goods in wooden ships. They harvested fish with nets. They fought wars on land, not underwater. The sea was a connector, not a resource deposit. It did not need to be owned to be useful. For centuries, this informal order formed the backbone of global commerce. Spices, silver, slaves, textiles, and eventually industrial goods crossed the oceans freely. The wealth of empires flowed across international waters without anyone needing to ask permission. But this balance rested on an unspoken assumption that the ocean itself could not be industrially exploited. The moment that assumption broke, the entire legal architecture began to crack. The Second World War did not just redraw political borders, it changed the physics of power. Military necessity drove enormous advances in engineering, navigation, and offshore technology. When the war ended, those tools did not disappear. They migrated into civilian and industrial use. Geologists soon realized something unsettling. The continental shelf, the submerged extension of a nation's landmass, was not empty. It was rich in oil and gas, and unlike the deep ocean, it was accessible, drillable, profitable. Suddenly, the old 3-mile rule looked absurd. An industrial superpower with a global navy and an energy-hungry economy could not be constrained by the range of a 17th-century cannon. The legal fiction of the free sea was colliding with the material reality of modern industry, and it was the United States, emerging from World War II as the dominant economic and military power on Earth, that moved first. In doing so, it shattered centuries of maritime tradition and set off a chain reaction that would eventually bring us to the edge of conflict in the abyss. In 1945, as the smoke of World War II still hung over Europe and Asia, President Harry Truman made a decision that would quietly reshape the legal order of the oceans. There was no international conference, no negotiation, no vote. Through a unilateral presidential proclamation, Truman declared that the United States would henceforth claim exclusive jurisdiction over the natural resources of its entire continental shelf regardless of how far it extended beneath the ocean. It was a revolutionary act. For the first time in modern history, a nation asserted ownership not over the water itself, but over the wealth hidden beneath it. Oil, gas, and minerals buried under the seabed were no longer part of the global commons. They were American assets. Truman's motivation was not ideological, it was practical. The United States had just emerged as the world's industrial engine, and that engine ran on energy. Offshore drilling technology, refined during the war, made these resources reachable. Leaving them unclaimed was no longer an option. But, in solving an immediate economic problem, Truman shattered a legal norm that had survived for centuries. Because if the United States, then the most powerful country on Earth, could unilaterally rewrite the rules of the ocean to suit its economic interests, there was no principled reason why anyone else could not do the same. Pandora's box was open. The reaction was swift, and it did not come from Europe or the great powers. It came from Latin America. Nations like Chile, Peru, and Ecuador looked north and saw precedent being set. They did not have vast continental shelves rich in oil, but they did have something else, some of the richest fishing grounds on the planet. If Washington could claim the resources under the mud, why couldn't they claim the resources in the water? These countries responded by extending their sovereignty not by a few miles, but by 200 nautical miles from their coastlines. It was a staggering expansion, an assertion that transformed large swaths of open ocean into national economic zones. What followed was chaos. By the 1960s, the one simple system of freedom of the seas was collapsing under the weight of competing claims. Coastal states everywhere began grabbing as much ocean as they could. The global commons was being carved up in real time, with no referee and no shared rulebook, and this time, the United States was on the receiving end of the consequences. The U.S. Navy, which depended on unrestricted access to the world's oceans to project power against the Soviet Union, suddenly saw a nightmare forming. If every nation claimed hundreds of miles of territorial waters, the oceans would become a patchwork of closed zones. Fleets would need permission to move, trade. Routes could be strangled. Power projection would be crippled. The empire that had broken the old rules now found itself threatened by the new ones, and that fear would soon drive an ambitious attempt to rebuild order, this time not through unilateral power, but through international law. By the mid-1960s, it was clear that the oceans were drifting toward anarchy. Coastal states were expanding their claims. Maritime powers were pushing back. New technologies were making the deep seabed not just the continental shelf economically relevant. For the first time, and looming over everything, was a terrifying possibility that the ocean floor itself would become militarized, colonized, and weaponized by the strongest states. It was in this atmosphere of rising tension that an unlikely figure entered the story. In 1967, Arvid Pardo, a diplomat from the tiny island nation of Malta, stepped onto the podium at the United Nations. Malta had no navy, no mining companies, and no hope of competing in a technological arms race beneath the sea. But Pardo understood something fundamental about power vacuums. If the deep seabed was left unregulated, it would not remain neutral, it would be taken. Pardo delivered a speech that cut through the legal jargon and went straight to the moral core of the problem. He warned that without collective rules, the ocean floor would become the next arena of imperial competition and underwater scramble driven by technology and force rather than law. His solution was radical. The seabed beyond national jurisdiction, he argued, should not belong to whoever arrived first. It should not belong to the richest, the strongest, or the most technologically advanced. Instead, it should be designated as the common heritage of mankind. This phrase was revolutionary. It meant that the manganese, cobalt, nickel, and copper lying thousands of meters beneath the Pacific did not belong to any single nation. They belonged to humanity as a whole, and if they were ever to be exploited, it would have to happen under an international regime, with the benefits shared equitably, especially with developing countries that had been excluded from centuries of resource extraction. For the newly independent nations of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, this idea was electrifying. These states, many of them former colonies, organized themselves into a powerful voting bloc known as the Group of 77. They saw the seabed not as charity, but as compensation, a chance to legally claim a share of global wealth that had previously been monopolized by imperial powers. Their argument was simple and emotionally potent. The industrialized world had already stripped the continents of resources. It should not be allowed to do the same to the oceans. In 1970, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution enshrining Pardo's principle. Even the United States, under President Richard Nixon, initially supported the idea. Nixon was no idealist, but he was a pragmatist. He understood that stable rules governing the oceans were a fair price to pay for guaranteed freedom of navigation for the U.S. Navy. And so began the most ambitious legal experiment in human history. The world set out to write a constitution for 70% of the Earth's surface. In 1973, representatives from around the world gathered for what would become the longest and most complex diplomatic negotiation in modern history, the Third United Nations Conference on the Law of THEC. The ambition was unprecedented. The goal was nothing less than to codify rules for 70% of the planet, to define who could fish where, who could drill where, how far national sovereignty extended, and most controversially of all, who would control the resources of the deep ocean floor. For 9 exhausting years, the negotiations dragged on. The conference hall became a battlefield of competing interests. Maritime powers like the United States and the Soviet Union fought to preserve freedom of navigation. Coastal states pushed to lock in their 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones. Landlocked countries demanded a voice in a system that otherwise excluded them entirely. But beneath all of these disputes lay the real ideological fault line: deep-sea mining. The Group of 77, emboldened by their numerical majority, pushed for a tightly controlled, centrally managed system. They argued that without strict oversight, the wealth of the seabed would inevitably be captured by a handful of advanced economies. Repeating the injustices of colonial history, their proposal went far beyond regulation. They demanded the creation of a new global authority, the International Seabed Authority, or ISA. This body would not merely issue permits. It would actively participate in mining through a UN-run commercial arm known as the enterprise. The conditions imposed on private companies were sweeping. Any firm seeking a mining license would be required to identify equally valuable sites. One would be reserved for the company, the other would be handed over to the ISA. All geological data would be shared. Proprietary mining technology would be transferred to the enterprise, and to developing nations, production levels would be capped. Fees and royalties would be imposed to prevent price collapses that might harm land-based miners. For the developing world, this was fairness. For the industrialized West, it looked like expropriation. To American policymakers steeped in free market ideology, the proposal was nothing short of global socialism. The idea that U.S. companies would spend billions developing cutting-edge technology only to be forced to surrender it to an international bureaucracy was politically toxic. As the 1970s wore on, the negotiations became increasingly bitter. Compromises were proposed, withdrawn, and rewritten. Trust eroded, patience thinned, and then, in 1980, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States. His administration arrived in Washington with a radically different worldview, one that would bring the entire project to a breaking point. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, he brought with him a philosophy that stood in direct opposition to the emerging law of the sea framework. Reagan believed in free markets, limited government, and American strategic autonomy. To his administration, the deep seabed mining regime being negotiated at the United Nations looked like a textbook example of everything they despised: centralized control, mandatory technology transfers, price manipulation, and wealth redistribution enforced by international bureaucracy. When U.S. negotiators reviewed the final draft of the treaty in 1982, they were alarmed. They saw a system that constrained American companies while empowering a global institution that Washington did not control. Worse, they believed it would lock the United States into a permanent disadvantage, forcing it to subsidize competitors and surrender technological leadership in the name of equity. On April 30, 1982, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea was adopted by an overwhelming majority of nations. The United States voted no, but Reagan did not stop there. Rather than rejecting the treaty outright and isolating the U.S. from maritime law entirely, he executed a far more sophisticated maneuver, one only a superpower could attempt. In March 1983, Reagan issued a unilateral proclamation declaring that the United States would recognize and enforce all provisions of the treaty that reflected customary international law. This included the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, and, most critically, freedom of navigation for naval and commercial vessels. But the deep seabed mining regime, that part was flatly rejected. In effect, the United States decided to consume the strategic benefits of the treaty while discarding its economic obligations. It accepted the rules that preserved naval dominance and global trade, but refused to submit to an international authority that could constrain American industry. This maneuver infuriated much of the world, yet there was little anyone could do. Without the world's largest economy and most powerful navy, the treaty lacked its primary enforcement engine. For years, the law of the sea existed in a kind of legal limbo, accepted in principle, but weakened in practice. In the early 1990s, as the Cold War ended and optimism about global cooperation surged, a renewed effort was made to bring the United States back into the fold. The most controversial elements of the mining regime were renegotiated. In 1994, a new implementation agreement stripped away many of the socialist features that Washington had opposed. The Clinton administration signed it. But in the American system, a signature is not enough. Treaties require ratification by a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate, and their lingering suspicion of the United Nations proved insurmountable. The Senate refused to ratify the agreement. When the law of the sea finally entered into force later that year, establishing the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica, the United States was not a member. The world's greatest maritime power was standing outside a system it had helped design, and in that absence, a vacuum formed. For nearly 2 decades after the law of the sea formally came into force in 1994, the deep ocean remained largely untouched. The reason was not law, it was economics. The technology was immature. Commodity prices were stable, and the political attention of the United States was consumed elsewhere, first by the War on Terror, then by the global financial crisis of 2008. Deep-sea mining remained a theoretical future problem, but while Washington was distracted, Beijing was planning. The Chinese Communist Party looked at the long arc of industrial history and reached a conclusion that American policymakers largely missed. The 20th century had been powered by oil, the 21st would be powered by electrons, and electrons require metals, not just any metal, strategic metals, nickel, cobalt, manganese, and copper would become the bottlenecks of the green energy transition. Electric vehicles, grid storage, and advanced weapons systems. Whoever controlled their supply would control the tempo of the global economy. China did not see the International Seabed Authority as a constraint, it saw it as an opportunity, while the United States stood outside the institution arguing about sovereignty. China entered fully, it paid its dues, it sent delegates, it trained scientists, it embedded bureaucrats, it played the long game of institutional capture. Over the last 15 years, China has used its state-owned enterprises to secure more exploration contracts from the ESA than any other nation on Earth. Today, Chinese entities control 5 separate deep-sea exploration zones, roughly 90,000 square miles of some of the most mineral-rich seabed on the planet, but contracts were only part of the strategy. Influence in UN bodies is built through presence and financing. With the United States absent, China became one of the ISA's largest contributors. It cultivated alliances with developing nations, African states, Pacific Island countries, and members of the Group of 77 that held decisive voting power in the Assembly. China helped build the headquarters, it trained the experts, it shaped the technical standards. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the principle of the common heritage of mankind began to morph into something far more national. By the early 2020s, China was no longer preparing for deep-sea mining, it was ready, and by 2024, The moment of decision arrived. ESA was moving to finalize the long-awaited mining code, the rulebook that would allow commercial extraction to finally begin. For China, this was the endgame. For the United States, it was an alarm bell. By early 2025, the strategic picture had become impossible for Washington to ignore. The International Seabed Authority was preparing to approve its first full commercial mining licenses. Chinese firms already had the ships. They had purpose-built deep-sea harvesting robots. They had the processing capacity back home. And most importantly, they had legal cover. If the mining code passed, China would begin extracting seabed metals under the full legitimacy of international law. Cheap nickel and cobalt would flood global markets. Battery supply chains would tilt decisively toward Beijing. The green energy transition sold as a pathway to energy independence would instead deepen strategic dependence. For the U.S. auto industry, the implications were existential. American electric vehicle manufacturers would be forced to buy critical minerals from Chinese-controlled entities or fall behind in a brutally competitive market. The supply chain trap would snap shut. This was the intelligence briefing that likely landed on President Trump's desk in early 2025. The choice was stark: remain outside the system and watch a rival legally dominate the resource base of the future, or tear up the rulebook. On April 24, 2025, Trump chose confrontation. The executive order he signed was titled Ensuring American Critical Mineral Independence. It did not merely bypass the International Seabed Authority, it asserted an entirely new legal theory. The administration argued that, because the United States had never ratified the law of the Sea Treaty, it was not bound by the ISAS authority. Instead, it would revert to customary international law, under which the extraction of seabed resources could be treated as a freedom of the high seas so long as other nations were given due regard. The order authorized the Department of the Interior to issue deep-sea mining licenses directly to American companies. These licenses would be backed not by UN permits, but by the full protection of the U.S. government and, implicitly, the U.S. Navy. In effect, the President issued letters of marque for the 21st century. The message to American industry was unmistakable: go get it. We will protect you. Markets reacted instantly. Shares of defense contractors and speculative mining startups surged. Venture capital began circling. But in diplomatic capitals around the world, the reaction was explosive. The European Union condemned the move as piracy. The International Seabed Authority declared any U.S. licensed mining illegal and void. And China, with exquisite irony, accused the United States of behaving like a rogue state that disrespects international law. But a signature on paper does not build a mine. And this is where the conflict moved from ideology to brutal economic reality. Issuing licenses was the easy part. Actually extracting metal from 4,000 meters below the ocean surface was something else entirely. Deep-sea mining is not oil drilling. There are no established giants. No decades of operational muscle memory. Every system from pressure-resistant robotics to sediment plumes or lifting mechanisms exists at the bleeding edge of engineering. And here, America's legal bravado ran headlong into a hard truth. China had already done the boring work for more than a decade. Chinese research vessels had logged thousands of hours mapping the seabed. State-owned enterprises had built and tested prototype mining crawlers. Processing plants had been quietly upgraded to handle polymetallic nodules long before anyone else took the idea seriously. The United States, by contrast, had world-class universities and startups, but no coordinated industrial strategy. American companies now held paper licenses backed by presidential authority. But they still needed billions of dollars, years of testing, environmental approvals, and most critically buyers willing to accept minerals whose legal status was disputed. This uncertainty poisoned the market. Banks hesitated to finance projects that could be sanctioned or blocked at foreign ports. Insurance companies refused to underwrite vessels that might be seized in legal limbo. Battery manufacturers worried that buying U.S. extracted seabed metals could trigger trade retaliation from the EU or China. Meanwhile, China didn't need to fire a shot. It simply continued doing what it had always done: control downstream choke points. Chinese firms dominated mineral refining, cathode production, and battery assembly. Even if an American company managed to haul nodules from the seabed, it would likely need to ship them to China for processing. The supposed act of independence risked looping back into dependence. And then there was the environmental front. NGOs and European governments launched coordinated campaigns framing deep-sea mining as an ecological catastrophe. Images of destroyed abyssal ecosystems flooded media outlets. Lawsuits piled up in international courts. Public opinion turned hostile. For investors, the message was clear: this was radioactive. China, sensing the moment, positioned itself as the responsible actor. It called for scientific caution. It delayed its own mining timelines. And it quietly let American firms take the reputational heat. By late 2025, it became obvious that unilateralism had not solved the problem, it had exposed it. The United States could act alone, but it could not act cheaply, quickly, or quietly. And that raised a far more dangerous question: what happens when economic leverage fails? Historically, when markets fail to resolve strategic competition, states reach for something older and more reliable: power. By the end of 2025, it was clear that deep-sea mining was no longer just an industrial or environmental debate. It had become a question of who would physically control access to the global commons. The United States Navy understood this dynamic immediately. Unlike diplomats and regulators, naval planners operate on a simpler logic: presence equals control, and control, once established, tends to become reality regardless of what legal texts say. In the Pacific, U.S. naval patrols began increasing around known polymetallic nodule fields, particularly in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. Officially, these patrols were framed as freedom of navigation operations, and officially, they were signals. American mining vessels, still experimental and few in number, were escorted. Surveillance assets tracked Chinese research ships more closely. What had once been abstract law was now embodied by steel hulls and sonar contacts. China responded in kind. Navy auxiliary vessels began accompanying Chinese research expeditions. Beijing avoided overt militarization, but the message was unmistakable: Chinese assets would not operate alone. The seabed itself became a new strategic layer. Undersea cables, sensor networks, and autonomous vehicles turned the ocean floor into a contested battle space. Any disruption, intentional or accidental, could be framed as sabotage. Attribution would be murky, escalation ladders would be short, and unlike the South China Sea, there were no islands to occupy, no airstrips to build. Control would be invisible, technical, and deniable. This was a nightmare scenario or alliance politics. European states, dependent on Chinese supply chains but tied to American security guarantees, found themselves trapped. Publicly, they opposed unilateral U.S. mining. Privately, they feared being locked out of future resource access. Smaller developing nations watched nervously as the promise of the common heritage of mankind dissolved into a great power standoff they could not influence. By early 2026, the risk calculus had shifted. No one wanted war over rocks on the ocean floor, but no one wanted to lose access either. And that is exactly how strategic instability is born. The battle over deep-sea mining is not really about nickel or cobalt. It is about a much deeper question: who gets to write the rules of the future? For 70 years, the United States built a world in which power flowed through institutions. Bretton Woods, the WTO, the UN system, rules were America's greatest strategic weapon because America helped design them. But in the case of the deep ocean, the United States walked away, and China did not. Beijing followed the textbook of 20th century American statecraft almost perfectly. It joined institutions. It staffed them. It financed them. It waited. And when the moment arrived, it found itself holding the pen, America's response unilateral action backed by 4 signals. Something profound. This is what it looks like when a hegemon loses faith in the system it once created. The consequences extend far beyond the seabed. If the United States succeeds, it establishes a precedent. Powerful states can ignore multilateral governance when it becomes inconvenient, resource extraction, environmental rules, and global commons will fragment into spheres of control. If the United States fails, the lesson is equally stark. Institutional patience beats raw power in the long run. Either way, the era of uncontested global governance is over. The ocean floor is merely the opening act. Space, Arctic resources, AI governance, rare earths, undersea data cables, all are moving toward the same fault line between rule-based order and power-based order. Deep-sea mining is not the end of the story, it is the rehearsal, and the world should be paying attention.